Okay, so on to viruses. So viruses are amazing little structures. They depend on cells, such as ours, to survive, right? So a virus that gets into your system, whether it's a viral throat infection or a viral lung infection, um, viruses will get into your cells, and then they use your cells and the machinery of your cells to produce their own proteins and to replicate within your cell. And once they replicate and make new viruses within your cell, the cell is destroyed, it breaks open and releases even more viruses into the bloodstream. Okay, so a virus really is not a cell. It's just a collection of DNA or RNA. And that's why we have RNA viruses and there's DNA viruses. Okay, and definitely viruses are the most abundant microbe that infect humans. Okay, there's hundreds and hundreds of viruses that infect humans. Um, and viruses, you can get a viral infection and have an active disease. So, for example, just the common cold is an active viral infection that does not need antibiotics. Antibiotics do not affect viruses. Or you can have what's called a latent infection, where the virus is living in your body and every once in a while it gets reactivated. And a perfect example of that is the herpes virus that causes a cold sore, or genital herpes type 2, which causes genital herpes, right? And you get genital sores from them. They they heal, they become inactive again, only to become reactivated later on at a future date. Okay, so really viruses need your cells, your host cells, to replicate and live. And of course, as we saw on a diagram above, they're tiny little structures. So here's an electron microscope image of a virus. Okay, there's not much to them. At the top of this particular virus is where it'll store the RNA and DNA that needs to be incorporated into your cell, your genome. And then once it's incorporated into your DNA, it can take over your DNA and produce its own viral particles and viral proteins that it needs to replicate and make more viral particles. Okay, so here's the components of a virus, right? So it'll have a very basic strand of RNA or DNA that'll have a capsule or a capsid surrounding it. Then with an envelope that's surrounding the RNA or the DNA, and this particular structure will then have to find a way to enter your cells, incorporate itself into your DNA, and take over control, and produce its own proteins from its own RNA or DNA. Okay, so pretty amazing infectious disease compared to bacteria. So viruses are very hard to treat, and that's why we don't have many antivirals around. Okay, we do have some that treat the herpes virus, that treat herpes zoster, that treat HIV, but in general, we don't have a lot of antiviral medications. Okay, so what's the goal of a virus? It's to survive and replicate in your body, in your cells, right? So really a virus will have just enough DNA or RNA to accomplish that. And how will it do that? It'll insert its DNA into your own DNA, okay? And then it'll take over the function of your DNA, allowing the virus to replicate and make thousands and thousands of new copies of the virus that will break open out of the cell and travel to other cells in your body and infect those cells. Now, luckily, most of the time, your immune system catches up with the virus and destroys it. There are some viruses that can remain latent in your body, and we mentioned some, such as herpes simplex 1, herpes simplex 2, HIV, the shingles virus, which is the varicella zoster virus. It's the same virus that gave a patient chickenpox earlier on in life. Well, that virus stays with you. It lives in your nervous system, and it comes out as herpes zoster later in life. Okay? And we'll talk about that in more detail later. So there's many types of viruses that can infect the body, and some of them can lead to infection and then remain in the body for the rest of the human's life. HIV is one. The herpes viruses is another. Chickenpox, which is varicella zoster, is another one that causes chickenpox and then remains in your nervous system and can come out later and lead to this blistering rash called shingles. Okay, so you can see that there's significant differences between viruses and how hard they can be to treat, because really they're within your cells compared to bacteria that don't try to get into your cells. They just cause direct invasion with their own cells. Okay, so here's a nice image of how a virus replicates within your body or within one of your cells. And this will become more important when we're talking about HIV in another module, and how HIV gets into your T helper cells, which is part of your immune system cells, and replicates and makes more HIV to then leave that cell and infect other cells. Okay, so in this image you can see an individual viral particle, the virion, that's able to get through the plasma membrane and then attach itself to the nucleus, incorporate itself in your DNA. Okay, and then once it's in your DNA, it can command the genome or your DNA to produce particular proteins that it needs for its survival and to make new viral particles. And then the viral particles destroy that cell and go on and get released to go and infect other cells. Okay, and this applies to any virus that infects the body. Okay, so the 5 steps to infection with a virus. The first one will be attachment of where the virion in the image above attaches to the cell membrane. And this is going to be very important when we talk about HIV. But again, it applies to any virus, whether it's HIV or a hepatitis virus in the liver cells. Attachment is the first step, where it attaches to the cell. It penetrates into the host cell, so into the cytoplasm. There's an uncoding process where the virus now can release its DNA into the cell cytoplasm. Then the DNA of the virus enters the host DNA and then takes command and produces its own particular proteins that it wants to produce to make its own new viral particles. So it assembles new viral particles within the cell, and then they're packaged and released out into the bloodstream by the thousands to then go and infect other cells. So there's a whole process to it, and any virus that infects the body behaves this way. Okay, so this slide is essentially showing you the same steps of a viral infection in a cell, right, in a host cell, and which will result in new viral particles, which is B, the top left there. But let's look at the other side on the right. So there's many viruses that become latent, right? They live in your body, but they're not actively causing a disease right now. And we can use the example of chicken pox, that then after the disease remains latent and can become herpes zoster, or what's called shingles, later on in life, and give you a blistering rash along one nerve root. Okay. Another example is the virus human papillomavirus, HPV, which is, by the way, the virus that gives you the common wart on your skin. It's also a sexually transmitted virus that can give you genital warts. In women that get genital warts, the virus can remain latent in their cervix, in the cervical cells, and it can cause the cervical cells to become abnormal over time. It can cause them to become precancerous, a condition that we refer to as dysplastic. So any cell that is becoming abnormal or precancerous, we will refer to as dysplastic cells. And you'll learn more about dysplastic cells in an upcoming module. But what happens with dysplastic cells is they can become cancerous cells. So women can develop cervical cancer from HPV virus, right? And that's why there is now an HPV vaccine that's given to women, and in some states given to men as well. Well, I should say girls and boys, because you get it at an earlier age. So the idea of receiving the HPV vaccine is to prevent cervical cancer in women, because this virus can stain the cervical cells, cause them to become dysplastic, and then finally cancerous. In men or in boys, it's given in some locations because it prevents genital warts. And genital warts in boys can cause penile cancer. But the other reason it's given in boys is so that they don't acquire genital warts and pass it on to women. Okay? So HPV vaccine is definitely out there to prevent cervical cancer. Now, we already had a very good screening tool for cervical cancer called the Pap test, right? So women can go and have a Pap test every 2 to 3 years, which is a scraping, a sampling of their cervix that's put under a microscope to see if there's any dysplastic cells or cancerous cells. Okay, so the Pap test is a very good screening test for cervical dysplasia and cervical cancer. So you can see that some viruses not only remain latent and become active later on, such as chickenpox or the herpes virus, but also some cancers can lead to some viruses can lead to cancers. And in this example, we used cervical cancer and the HPV virus. Okay. Another example would be the hepatitis B or hepatitis C virus that can remain in a chronic state or a latent state in the liver. And years later, you can develop liver cancer from the hepatitis virus. Okay, so viruses don't only replicate in the cells and then go and infect other cells. Some can lead to cancer later in life because they've remained latent and active within the cell itself, and finally those cells become cancerous years later. Okay, so still on viruses, what happens to the host cell once it's infected with a virus? Well, it eventually dies. And why does it die? Well, the cell isn't able to produce ATP or repair itself because the virus has taken over the DNA controls, right? And it's using the cell's own energy. Okay. So I know I spoke about this on the slide above, which I tend to do quite a bit of. So at the bottom part of this, let's just look at some viruses that remain in the host cell and lead to persistent viral infections. And this will be important later in other modules where you'll learn about these viruses in particular. So a persistent infection, meaning the virus is just staying in those cells and the immune system just can't get rid of it. An example is hepatitis B or hepatitis C that persists in the liver cells and is constantly dividing and damaging the liver, and in the end can lead to a cancer or to cirrhosis, which is basically scarring and fibrosing of the liver, and that leads to liver failure. A latent virus, which is just living in the virus until it becomes active, would be herpes simplex 1 or herpes simplex 2. It's latent until it becomes active, say for example because of stress or because of an illness that's reduced your immunity, and suddenly the herpes virus is active, gives you a cold sore or gives you genital herpes. Chickenpox. You get chickenpox, that blistering rash or that vesicular rash all over your body, and then it remains in your dorsal root, which is a part of your spinal cord, and later on it expresses itself as herpes zoster or shingles. Viruses can be oncogenic, meaning cancer causing, and the example that we use for that is human papillomavirus on the cervix, or hepatitis B or C leading to liver cancer. So those are oncogenic viruses. Some viruses can suppress the immune system, and the perfect example of that is how HIV suppresses the immune system by destroying the T helper cells in the immune system. Okay, so there's very simple viruses like the common cold that the body can easily clear and get rid of. There's other ones that persist in the cells or remain latent in cells or can lead to cancers, oncogenic, or even suppress the immune system permanently, such as HIV. Okay, still on viruses here. So viruses are definitely the most common infectious agent infecting humans, and the vast majority of them do not result in hospitalization or death. Okay, so the common cold, which is typically a rhinovirus or a coronavirus, your body usually just clears on its own. I know COVID is an example of uh, a, a coronavirus that can result in serious illness or death, but that's typically the exception for that group of viruses. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and C, they're all acquired in slightly different ways. Hepatitis A is the most minor of the three infections. You typically get it from consuming contaminated food or water. So it's an oral portal of entry, and your body takes care of it. It clears hepatitis A. Hepatitis B and C are typically more serious viral infections of the liver. Okay, chickenpox, herpes zoster, other examples of viruses that don't typically put you in a hospital or cause death. Influenza, for the majority of people, doesn't lead to death, but definitely if you're immunocompromised or if you're older, influenza A or influenza B can definitely lead to serious illness and death. And that's why we have vaccinations for influenza. Okay, we actually have vaccinations for hepatitis A and hepatitis B as well, and the chickenpox virus. Herpes 1, which typically gives you a cold sore. Herpes 2 gives you genital herpes. HPV gives you warts. HPV, it can also be sexually transmitted to cause genital warts or cervical dysplasia and cervical cancer. Okay, some viruses are much more lethal, such as HIV. If HIV is untreated with a cocktail of medications, it will lead to immune destruction and death from typically opportunistic infections, right? So once you develop AIDS from the HIV virus, you often start to develop a lot of opportunistic infections, many of which are deadly. Rabies is a virus that affects the nervous system that can definitely kill you. In fact, if you get rabies and it affects your nervous system, the death rate is close to 100%. Ebola, another virus, relatively rare, but it has a very high kill rate. The polio virus. We're all vaccinated against polio, but polio affected the nervous system, causing paralysis. So that was a very disabling and also deadly virus. Okay, what about viral medications? What's the goal of an antiviral? So typically any antiviral medication, whether it's for HIV or if it's to try and treat a cold sore or genital herpes, it's really just to try and block the virus from dividing within the cell of the patient, right? There's very few cures for viral infections in terms of antivirals. The majority of viruses are destroyed by the patient's own immune system, luckily. Okay, so there aren't a lot of medications. There's very few of them, which is going to make studying antiviral medications in pharmacology a bit more easy compared to antibacterial medications, the antibiotics. Okay, so there are some treatments for certain viruses, but in general, most viruses in the body are cleared by the immune system itself.